Graziano. Very Hamish. I would have preferred if they'd asked him to speak in Yiddish, actually. For reasons briefly alluded to by my beloved, long-standing friend, Rabbi Baruch Lichtenstein, there are profound personal sentiments intermingled with the deep sense of pride which I feel in having been invited to play a small role in such an auspicious occasion in the history of the Kozlov Torah Academy and in the history of Philadelphia Jewry. I'm grateful for the invitation. Some years ago, on a particular occasion, my beloved Rebbe, the previous Bobber Rebbe, Reb Shlomo Halberstam, was a passenger in a car traveling north on the FDR Drive on the east side of Manhattan. At one point, the car moved to the right to head up the ramp, leading to the exit to East 42nd Street. From that ramp, one gains a marvelous view of the United Nations complex with the tall, rectangular-shaped, all-glass Secretariat building, and beside it, the low, flat-topped General Assembly building. For a few seconds from that ramp, those two buildings are juxtaposed in such a way that they bear an uncanny resemblance to a matzeva, to a tombstone. One of the fellow passengers in the car pointed out to the Rebbe that they were passing the United Nations building. He instantaneously grasped the significance of the relationship between those two buildings and immediately retorted, "This is the place where they buried the truth, and that's the matzeva." We are accustomed to an institution that turns a blind eye to suicide bombers and other terrorists. We are accustomed to a Human Rights Council of the United Nations, which passes more anti-Israel resolutions than resolutions against all other countries on this planet combined. All of that is true, and sad, tragic, and extremely unfortunate. There is another side, a side that we don't know about. In many ways, it's even worse, and it takes place under the radar screen, out of the public eye, in fora which are not reported at all in the press. The General Assembly of the United Nations contains within it all members of the UN at any particular time. At the moment, it's 193 countries. Underneath the General Assembly are 6 committees, and on each of those 6 committees, all countries are represented. The meetings of those committees are usually preliminary to resolutions being handed up to the General Assembly for consideration. And the deliberations of those committees invariably take place out of the public eye. They're never reported. A number of years ago, the United Nations General Assembly began to pass an annual resolution for the protection of children. It was an important resolution. It was a motherhood-type resolution talking about the importance of protecting children. It was totally unobjectionable, and in fact, it was extremely laudable. Children are the most vulnerable members of society. They are least able to protect themselves and are therefore most in need of protection. Around the turn of this century, the Palestine Liberation Organization representative of the UN arranged to have a new resolution introduced for the protection of the Palestinian child. The United States and Israel both voted against that resolution, not because they were against protecting Palestinian children. Of course, Palestinian children should also be protected, like everyone else. But there was no reason to single out Palestinian children more so than any others. Everyone was covered by the general resolution. In 2003, the then Israeli ambassador to the United Nations, Ben Gilman, made an important tactical decision, not simply to oppose the resolution for the protection of Palestinian Arab children, but to introduce a resolution of his own for the protection of Israeli children. The Israeli resolution was designed as a mirror image of the Palestinian Children Resolution and broadly followed its contours. No sooner was the Israeli resolution introduced in the Third Committee of the General Assembly for the purpose of discussion before going to the General Assembly itself, than a series of Arab and Muslim countries introduced resolutions which they called amendments. In fact, they weren't amendments. What those resolutions did was two things. First of all, they sought to emasculate entirely the resolution in favour of the protection of Israeli children. One of the ways they did that was simply to take the word Israeli out of the resolution wherever it appeared, including in the title of the resolution itself, so it meant nothing anymore. Secondly, what they did was to introduce a number of additions to the resolution, castigating Israel roundly for a whole lot of its practices, and in that way they sought to turn the resolution against Israel. Ben Gilman realised that what they would end up with was yet another anti-Israel resolution on the books of the General Assembly, and so he very wisely withdrew the Israeli resolution. And he did something unusual. As ambassador, he usually didn't go into the Third Committee. That was for lower officials in the mission. On this occasion, he walked into the General Assembly's Third Committee, withdrew the resolution, and delivered a beautiful, eloquent, and deeply moving speech in which he pointed out the double standard that was being applied. Palestinian Arab children did deserve protection, Israeli children did not. Permit me, please, to read to you from the letter that I wrote to Gilman after his deeply moving speech. Dear Ambassador Gilman, you did us proud today. Your speech in the Third Committee was a model of grace under extreme pressure and in particularly unpleasant and distasteful circumstances, spoken from the heart, but with great dignity and head held high. I must admit that as I read your words, I brushed away more than a few tears, even now, it's almost 10 years later. Tears for the innocent children you mentioned by name, so ruthlessly and callously cut down. Tears for the children, too numerous to be referred to individually, each one a precious gift from Hashem, heartlessly wrenched away from the life they had barely begun to live. Tears for the broken families over whose lives the clouds of mourning are forever destined to hover, and tears for the unborn and now never to be born generations of our great and eternal people, and with them their innate potential to contribute so much and to enrich the Jewish world and indeed all of humankind. When you spoke today, you spoke for all of us, eloquently proclaiming to the world that Jewish blood is not Hefker, and that children living in Israel have no less a right than children anywhere else to be allowed to live and to live their lives in peace and tranquility as children without the constant threat of terror at every step of the way. I would dearly like to think that for at least some of those present in the third committee, listening to you would have stirred in the inner recesses of their hearts some pangs of conscience, perhaps even a sense of shame. Admittedly, there is not much reason for optimism, but we can all take heart from the words of Koheles, Soif Dover Hakol Yishma. In the sorry spectacle that the United Nations has become, what you expressed today were words for the ages, and somewhere along the line, good must surely come out of them. When I wrote that, I had in mind the daughter of a very dear friend of mine with whom I'd grown up in Australia. They moved to Ramot in Jerusalem, and their 15-year-old daughter was blown up in the Sabara restaurant, her only crime being that she was in the wrong place at the right time, at the wrong time. A double standard. Israeli children do not deserve protection. That's an example of a hatred and a double standard within the UN itself, but it's a double standard and a hatred that is practiced by countries which are members of the United Nations. There's a second form of hatred and double standard, and it's applied in the UN organization itself. It's an institutional hatred and double standard. An example has occurred in late 2002, and it was perpetrated by the Secretary General of the United Nations, the Chief Executive Officer. The Palestinian Arabs in Khan Yunis in Gaza launched a mortar attack on Israel, aiming at civilian population and civilian population centers. The next day, Israel retaliated with a missile attack launched from a helicopter. After the initial mortar attack by the Palestinian Arabs, there was silence from the United Nations. The day after the Israeli retaliation, the Secretary General, Kofi Annan, issued a strong condemnation of the Israeli action. It was extremely unfair, to put it mildly, for two reasons. First of all, we know that the Palestinian Arabs, particularly now since Hamas has taken over Gaza, regularly use civilians, innocent men, women and children, as human shields. They embed civilian population among military personnel, military installations and military equipment, to the extent that you get multi-level buildings where one floor is residential occupation, the next floor is military installations, the next floor also civilian rentals, and so on, one floor after another, alternating between military and civilian. It's unconscionable, it's callous, it's cold-hearted, it demonstrates an utter disregard for the value of life. Needless to say, international law condemns that. It is absolutely illegal. Yet there was no mention of this whatsoever in Kofi Annan's condemnation of Israel. Secondly, it was unfair because a year and a half earlier, the same Secretary General, Kofi Annan, had issued a report on behalf of the United Nations in which he condemned